We have the opportunity tonight to listen to a conversation between two giants of the 20th century. Obviously, you know who they are. That's why you're here, so I'm not going to take much time to introduce them. I simply will say three things about each of them. First, Arthur Schlesinger was already famous 50 years ago in 1950 as the author of the great book, The Age of Jackson, and he has not slowed down since. His numerous books have won him every prize of which I am aware, including the Bancroft Prize, the Francis Parkman Prize, the National Book Award, the Pulitzer Prize twice, the National Institute and American Academy for Arts and Letters Gold Medal for History and Biography, and so it goes. There's so much you could say about Arthur Schlesinger, but I would like to say that I think one of his main distinctions is that he's been attacked from both the left and the right, which I take is evidence of his courage to take whatever stand he thinks is correct without regard to the consequences. Jacques Barzun. His genius has virtually spanned the 20th century. Some of you may have recently read in Columbia magazine his reminiscence about the history department. His reminiscence began in 1923, and he has remained centered around that department and the profession ever since. Along the way, he has written 32 books. He's been provost and dean of the graduate faculty at Columbia, twice president of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, which also awarded him the gold medal for criticism. What I think is interesting is that in 1997, at the age of 90, he decided to move from New York to the hometown of his lovely wife, because he thought at that point in time it was maybe better to move away from his busy life and settle down. Well, of course he didn't settle down. Among other things, at age 92, he's produced this book, From Dawn to Decadence, 500 Years of Western Cultural Life, 1500 to the Present, published by Harper Collins. It will be in the bookstores about the middle of May. He is now in the midst of a whirlwind tour that only Jacques could do. But of all the many things I think we could say about Jacques Barzun, I think this week at the beginning of baseball season, we might say what in some ways is the most unusual thing about him. Most of us go to Cooperstown, which is a lovely city in upstate New York, and we buy autographed baseballs. Jacques Barzun autographed a baseball, and it's in the Hall of Fame, along with his picture. Because among his many famous quotations is this one: "Whoever wants to know the heart and mind of America must learn about baseball." We are so honored and pleased that these two great men have been willing to come here and talk among us and with us on this evening. Thank you so much, Arthur and Jacques. I'll turn it over to you, Arthur.
From Dawn to Decadence is a very remarkable book. Jacques Barzun seems to have read everything, remembered everything, and woven the history of the Western mind and sensibility together in a relatively seamless whole. Jacques Barzun is essentially a historian, but a most unusual historian, because he is such a master of so many diverse forms of human expression: music, painting, philosophy, politics, war, statecraft, religion, science, morals, manners, and he understands them all, as a historian must, as revelations of the society that produced them. One of my favorite I have many favorites among Jacques' books, but one particular one is one he called A Stroll with William James. I invite you all to take a stroll with Jacques Barzun through the cultural history of the West, and I would add a word about the various typographical ingenuities in the book that aid the work of understanding and remembering. One further point, Jacques will be 93 next November. This glorious nonagenarian achievement makes one wonder whether somewhere near San Antonio, Jacques Barzun has found the fountain of youth that Ponce de Leon sought in vain. Anyway, Jacques, your example holds out hope for us all. I think we might begin by asking you, Jacques, what you have in mind by the word decadence.
It's a scary word, but it needn't be so at all. Decadence, as I hinted during the proceedings that were wired, it means falling away, falling apart. And it is something that happens over and over again in history. It may do so in a part of culture, or in more than half, or pretty much in the whole of a culture at a given time. It comes when the idea of every activity begins to lose its force and its appeal, because everything that it contains has been worked out. And the more rapid the falling away, the happier the prospect, because it levels the ground and enables the newcomers, the youth with bright new ideas to get started and to establish the next phase of history, to which we give the name of another culture. And the very beginning of the history that I undertake to tell in this book was an age of decadence. The 15th century found all sorts of institutions, and particularly the Catholic Church, in a sorry plight. Even the officials of the church said it needs reform from top to bottom. But one of the characteristics of decadence is that although many people see what ought to be done to move on, the institutions are so arthritic that they cannot. Nothing can be done. And we have an example of that today in the governments of the West, all of which say reform, reform, reform. They even say reinvent government, and very little happens. And similar situations adapted to each kind of human social and cultural activity present the same spectacle.
Is decadence irreversible?
Irreversible on the same track, yes. The engine cannot go back, although very often the next phase, and this is also characteristic of the age of the Protestant Revolution in the 16th century, claims that it is a return. The Protestants wanted to go back to the primitive church, which had no pope and no bishops and no elaborate ritual, just believers huddling together and hoping for grace from on high. That phase is a recurring theme in the 500 years that I treat of, and I give it the name of primitivism, the desire to simplify civilization when it gets too complicated, and being too complicated has reached a state of stagnation.
You disclaim in the book any cyclical theory of the pretensions of Spengler or Toynbee, yet is there not a cyclical element in your waves of recurrence?
No, I wouldn't call it cyclical, because that implies a return to the identical beginning, and the beginnings are all different. If you start looking at civilizations from Egypt through Greece, through the Roman Empire, and through the various stages of the medieval, you see that history doesn't repeat except at a level of abstraction. That is to say, the acts, the people are all different and all new, but you can say political action is very much the same now that it was in the time of Andrew Jackson, or you can find similarities, just as you can find similarities in the faces of people that you know. But each is individual, and I think each culture is individual.
I well remember Alfred North Whitehead giving his last lecture at Harvard in 1936. And his last words of his last lecture were, "Civilizations die of boredom." Boredom plays a role in I think this is a fascinating conception. And boredom is one of the agencies in your...
Oh, yes. I'm a great believer in boredom. I've seen it and I've felt it. And it comes over a people when, as I suggested before, certain great important ideas are worked out. For example, I think that the resistance of many young people and publicists of all kinds to European culture, saying the dead white European males and their books and their works ought to be thrown into the wastebasket. That is a rationalization of a feeling of boredom. We've heard it, we've seen it. Isn't there a phrase, we've been there? That is historical boredom, and when multiplied by millions of people, it leads to the state that we're discussing right here and now.
Would you relate the rise of fundamentalism around the world today, Protestant fundamentalism, Islam fundamentalism, Hindu fundamentalism, Jewish fundamentalism, would you relate that to the...
Yes, it reminds me of what was happening in 15th century Europe when the disaffection from the church began to be intense. There were all sorts of groups forming little cults. New schools were opened to teach what was felt to be the true faith, and so on. People look for something to believe in, and not only believe in the religious sense, but believe in the institutional sense, feeling that one belongs to a going concern and not to a dead old corporation that is static in routines. That is the situation of decay, decadence, demand for the new, and the necessary destruction before the new can really arise. Because one may have a splendid new idea, for example, of how to run schools. But what can be done when the whole school establishment is in power and sees no reason for giving it up? So there has to be positive decay and destruction. And it's very visible in the arts. The very notion that we have of anti-art means let us get rid of what we now call art. And we've gone pretty well along that way. The word minimalist expresses the same thing. And when the minimal gets to be a piece of canvas painted white all over and hung, and is called the latest in the way of the art of Leonardo and Rembrandt, we've come pretty well along to the level field.
Is this a prelude to a new flowering?
Yes, it leads to a re-beginning. not cyclical. We don't know what it's going to be like. If we knew, it wouldn't be new.
One of the things that, on this question of fundamentalism, there's a kind of urgent, fanatic quality
Yes.
about that. One of the things I was delighted to find in your book was the admiration, which I share, for Mr. Dooley, Finley Peter Dunn. Mr. Dooley's definition of a fanatic has always impressed me. A fanatic, Mr. Dooley said, is someone who does what the good Lord would do if he only knew the facts in the case. I think you know, as you look at the modern world today, most of the killing that's taking place around the world is religious killing. I mean, the big conflicts in Ireland, in the Middle East, in Ceylon, or Sri Lanka, as I now call it, in East Timor, and so on, Philippines. There are people who believe that it's their religious duty to extirpate people who disagree of another faith. Fanaticism seems to me, is this the necessary accompaniment of escape from boredom?
No, I don't think that fanaticism arises from boredom, but it arises from despair. Despair about the particular concerns or the particular situation that a group feels is a threat or a failure to perform the right things that this new urge demands.
But people in this state of exhaustion of old forms, old ideas, old institutions, are searching for something new, and they find it perhaps in a kind of revelation.
Yes, and they have a sense, perhaps not put into words, but they feel it strongly, that the old cohesive forces have given way. For example, the great creation of the Western world in the last 500 years has been the nation state, and the nation everywhere is falling apart, is crumbling. It's extraordinary to think, for example, that England, which isn't so big that it can afford to come into pieces again, is given Scotland and Wales each a parliament. We take it for granted because we read it in the paper, hear it on television, but that's an extraordinary fact. In France, after years of very tight nationhood, national feeling, the government is now subsidizing the revival of local dialects, of which there turn out to be much more than anybody thought there was, because the money is there.
No, one of the things that Jacques Barzun discusses, emphasizes in our current world, is the rise of separatism.
Yes.
And you find that everywhere. I mean, Yugoslavia, of course, the murderous example of the breakdown of Yugoslavia. But countries like Belgium, for example, the Flemings and the Walloons are now reaching a point of extreme tension. In Canada,
yes.
Canada, the most sedate and allegedly tranquil of countries, is on the verge of falling apart.
And when was it? 2 days ago that Miami said that they will resist the federal government.
The free city of Miami.
And there have been precedents. Martha's Vineyard threatened a few years ago to secede from Massachusetts, and Staten Island wants to pull away into the bay, not to be so near New York. Manhattan, rather.
Not altogether new. Mayor Fernando Wood, who was mayor of New York City during the Civil War when Jacques and I were much younger, wanted New York to secede. He was a pro-Confederate. So but this certainly, I think isn't this partly a consequence of globalization? The nation state as you say, is fading away. Daniel Bell once said, the nation state is too big for the small problems and too small for the big problems. So it is no longer the unit of the institutional unit of adaptation. At the same time, nationalism remains the most potent of political emotions.
The desire to be a nation with usually no notion of what it entails, because all these little states which dot the South Pacific are dependent on the old big powers. They can't defend themselves. Their economy needs continual injections. And the Comoros Islands off the east coast of Africa are a wonderful example. The total area is 820 square feet, and there are 4 islands. And for the last 15 years, one of them, the smallest, the Anjouan Island, has fought the federal government of those 4 820 square mile government, and now they have achieved their independence. and the neighboring nations...
And a seat in the United Nations.
The neighboring nations from Africa and to the east also celebrated that as a great feat of liberation.
Globalization is upon us in the sense that particularly the new technologies, the electronic, the cybernetic type technologies, elude national sovereignty. Cyberspace is beyond the control of individual states, and there's no possibility of a world government to impose the same controls over some of these things. That nations no longer have the power to decide their own economic destiny.
Yes.
And but the people are, I think, are plunged into this vast anonymous sea, which they don't like, they don't fully comprehend, they can't control, and they feel a great need for belonging. And they belong. This need for belonging results in a return to small units of some kind, whether defined religiously or ethnically. So in a certain sense, the more the world integrates, the more it disintegrates.
Yes. Everywhere, everybody wants to belong to a small, cozy group for protection, which has language of its own, traditions, religion, cookery, everything. We ourselves alone. Sinn Féin is the phrase that describes that. And it is going forward in this country to a far greater extent than anyone realizes. It doesn't mean that the national government will fall apart and leave only a checkerboard of small regions, but it does show the mood and the tendency. And it is heightened, I think, by the fact that all that Arthur has referred to, the modern world of technology, makes the individual feel oppressed, badgered, unhappy. And it's perfectly natural then to try to form a little family circle. And the family circle means the ethnic group, large or small.
You say in the book that the novel was a characteristic genre of the 19th century. I wonder whether you would elaborate on that and then speculate as to what or tell us what the characteristic genre of the 20th century was.
The novel suited the 19th century peculiarly well because the 19th century was aware of something that it called progress. Science and industry seemed to prove the reality of progress. And progress was an historical fact. That is, you don't know that you've progressed unless you compare the present with the past. So the 19th century was the century of history. People lapped up history the way they did novels. And the novel is a fictional history. It adopts all the tricks of narrative history, descriptions of incidents and psychology of movers and shakers, and very often among the early masterpieces of the novel, the setting is actual. It happens here, there, the other place. And by the end of the century, the novel has gone to such a pitch of historicity that the author is attacked if he misrepresents a particular detail, whether it's important or not. J.B. Priestley told me once that he would receive insulting letters if he had a character wandering about London and taking the wrong street from one place to another. So that's an extreme example of the feeling that the 19th century created about the novel form. It is also a very democratic form in two ways. First, it's about ordinary people, every kind of person. Unlike the tragedy in verse, which is about princes and kings and warriors, it's about you and me. In another way, the novel is democratic in being an incitement to envy on the one hand. You read about so-and-so and you wish you were situated the way they are, lucky as they are. And also, it's very snobbish. If you think back to any of the novels that you enjoyed, care to reread, and look at the characters who are badly treated, you find that they have red hair, or a loud voice, or too much chin, or poor table manners. It's pure snobbery that in a novel distinguishes the people you're supposed to like from those that you don't like. So that's very democratic. Now, you want the characteristic genre of the 20th century. I think if I were somebody else, I would say it's the film. But I don't think the film is a literary genre. So I can't give the proper answer. It's difficult to say what strictly literary work is characteristic of the 20th century. Perhaps the kind of popular philosophy that is expressed in aphorisms, in sayings, in names and nicknames. For example, the term highbrow and lowbrow. That seems to me a characteristic form of thought and expression. You can gather from that I think the characteristic genres today are very popular indeed in the sense of representing the thought of the people much more than the thought of unusual persons, highly gifted and also highly biased in one way or another. Perhaps we arrive through this fumbling of mine at the possible choice of the comics as the characteristic genre. I don't know. I'd like to leave it up to you later in the afternoon.
I'm going to take the liberty of solving one problem you raised in the book.
Oh, please.
That is, whether or not Jules Verne ever read H.G. Wells. He did read H.G. Wells.
Oh, good. Where did you find that out? Did you talk to either of them?
And I'll tell you what he said about H.G. Wells. Jules Verne tried to make his fantasies, his science fiction, correspond to available scientific knowledge. He thought it was a low trick to transgress the laws of physics and mechanics. And therefore, he objected to H.G. Wells. He said, Wells's stories do not repose on very scientific bases. I make mine on physics. He invents. I go to the moon in a cannonball discharged from a cannon. He goes to Mars in an airship, which he constructs of a metal which does away with the law of gravitation. Show me this metal. Let him produce it. And Wells agreed with Verne. He said that Jules Verne deals with actual possibilities, and Wells said that my stories are all fantasies.
Yes. Oh, I knew that Wells had read Verne and that their lives overlapped, but where did this interesting document come from?
Well, I will tell you. I have to look it up, but I have. Verne's, I think one of Verne's sons,
reported it. I see.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Many thanks.
You're interesting on the subject of women.
Oh.
Although the medieval poets of chivalry exalted their lady, they were not self-deceived. Only in the late 18th century, when sentimentalism infiltrated the Enlightenment, did women begin to be fragile by definition. Pure and ethereal, she was to be an object permanently sacred to the male, not just in poetry or while being courted. The 19th century conception of women. As you point out, there were many energetic and vigorous women in the 19th century. Yes. But still, this is related to the question of the 19th century novel, I suppose.
Well, I think I cite the example of Dickens, David Copperfield, who first endows David with Dora, who is a pretty little thing and adorable in every way, but she's totally incompetent. She has had no proper training as a housewife or anything else. She doesn't know that oysters have to be opened. And David's life is pretty miserable as a result. But things work out so that he has a chance to marry again. And Agnes is the ideal wife. She's strong-minded, she's intelligent, she's multi-competent, and she is the right sort of wife. And again, later, in our mutual friend, Bella, the attractive heroine, says, I'm going to be somebody. I don't want to be a doll in a doll's house. And that was written 15 years before Ibsen wrote his play with the title A Doll's House, which is one of the great documents in the rise of feminism.
You raised one question which has always baffled me, and that is the way in which the great, someone like Dickens, for example, produce such a constant body of work without benefit of typewriters, without benefit of computers, and at the same time conduct extensive correspondence. I mean, how did they do that?
I attribute it to the presence of a group of people who've totally forgotten about servants. It's perfectly true that we have absolutely no notion of the extent to which the world up to say 1920, to take a figure at random, depended on the servant class. And of course, they were well or badly treated, mostly badly, I suppose, but they helped the world's work. For example, when Leigh Hunt, an early 19th century English poet, was at his lowest financially, and was begging money from Byron and Shelley and other people, he and his wife and 2 children had 2 servants. Later on, I read somewhere that the admirals in the British Navy were being cut back from an allowance of 20 to 14 servants. Now, in Dickens's household, or George Eliot's, or any other writer, there would be 4 or 5 servants. And they did all sorts of things that now we do for ourselves, which liberated Dickens or Bulwer Lytton or George Eliot from drudgery to write, to give lectures. Dickens was an amateur actor, and he indulged in theatricals. As you pointed out, he did a million things that we are prevented from doing because we have to go through the chores we all know.
When you think of Shaw, whose volumes of correspondence, I mean, there were, what, 9 or 10 volumes of Bernard Shaw's letters.
Yes.
And at the same time, he was writing plays, he was writing prefaces, he was commenting on everything under the sun.
Yes.
I mean, the vitality of
Oh, they had, of course, great vitality, which could take advantage of this help.
I was interested in your comments on American writers. You say that that Edgar Allan Poe probably had more impact on European writers than, at least in its time, than I think people would be interested in thinking why you thought that.
Why he's not liked as much here as abroad?
Yes. Why? I mean, he had obviously great influence on Baudelaire and so on.
Yes.
And on Jules Verne.
Oh, that's perfectly true. And on Conan Doyle.
Yes. On the other hand, I would say an argument could be made that Emerson's influence on Nietzsche, for example, was very...
Well, the Europeans read very selectively in American literature. And one of Poe's tendencies was to read French literature more than English, so that his characteristic thought was colored much more than any other American writer by French writings. And the French then later on repaid the compliment by translating him and making him the father of the symbolist school of poetry. One reason I think that say in France, Poe is a greater figure than he is in this country, is that in this country, Poe's poetry rubs other poets the wrong way. They don't like his diction. They don't like his what they call his tricks for building a poem, whether it's the bells or the raven. Whereas in France, naturally, the English doesn't sound to them the way it does to us. And they take it as perfectly good diction, no different from Shakespeare's or Tennyson's or anybody else. So what may be considered a flaw in Poe's poetical genius disappears in the ears of other people. And that happens, of course, to many other poets and other international relations.
This is your book is a brilliant example of analytical history. It also is very readable. What do you make of the school of younger historians who think everything is a social construct? You still believe that there's something happened out there?
Oh, yes, I run into it all the time. They have no sense of history, for one thing. They are rotten with abstraction, which is the great disease of the modern world and another sign of decadence. When abstraction, which is of course indispensable, gets to be to the third or fourth degree, the world recedes and everything looks as if it had been made by the process of abstraction itself. And science, technology, all our gadgets and devices abstract. For example, you may think that you're hearing our voices. You're not hearing our voices. You're hearing an abstract made by this unsatisfactory... it's a serious thing. Don't laugh. We've got accustomed to the interposition of machinery or of ideas which have the force and effect of machinery between us and reality. So much so that if you notice, our language it tends to be more and more abstract. Somebody who speaks or thinks in hard, small words is considered simple-minded. The taxi driver of whom you ask what the weather report is doesn't say there's a chance of rain. He says precipitation possibility is 20%. And that's an abstract statement. It doesn't make you think of drops of water. And when they come down, you may be surprised.
I like your argument that all the internet does is to reproduce the same confusion that we already experience in the pre-internet world.
I think that's true.
I promised Betsy Gottbaum that this would end with audience participation. So I have no doubt that many questions arise, and Ken Jackson will preside over the question period.
We ask that if you have a question that you rise, that you put it in the form of a question rather than a speech. And that if we have a microphone, do we have a microphone? Go around. We'll try to reach you when you rise. So do I see any hands? Yes, sir, in the back.
Professor Barzun, would you say that the representative literary form of the 20th century is the biography and autobiography, and that both have, in gaining ascendancy over the novel, have become very fictional?
That's a very good suggestion. But one can question whether biography, as it is now practiced, is what ought to deserve that name. I find that these very thick books called biography are simply recorded gossip. But that doesn't spoil your point at all. If we regard the interest in biography, then it is the characteristic genre. As for autobiography, of course, it is ubiquitous, it is epidemic. And it started early in the 20th century, round about 1920s, after the First World War, when a great many young talents arose and felt that they must say something about their hard life as children. And so you had people who were perhaps 28 years old writing their autobiography, which made me think that there might be a useful literary custom, not a rule, to say that one should have done something before writing an autobiography.
On the other hand, Jacques, in 1919, the greatest American autobiography came out, The Education of Henry Adams.
Oh, yes. But then he was a 19th century character.
Yes.
Next question? Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to come back to I would like to come back to the question about the rise in fundamentalism. Would you say something more about why it is spreading throughout the world?
The rise of fundamentalism.
Oh. It's hard to speak about the subject because we tend to make them uniform in source, and character, and purpose, and they probably are not. I say this because of the situation that we've been witnessing in the Balkans. The fury and massacre there is deeply religious, a good deal more than national, since those countries have not been nations ever. There have been regions and ethnic groups, but religion has been their unifying force in the separate groups to which we give names of Albanians and so on. And there we recognize something that we must distinguish from what's happening in Lebanon or what's happening in Ireland. So if we extrapolate and say fundamentalism and bring in the American type and the Islamic type, which is subdivided, as we know, in 3 or 4 different kinds, we're not talking about a homogeneous situation or animus. So I prefer to withhold judgment where I haven't the material with which to judge fairly.
Wouldn't part of this be the search for certitude in an incomprehensible world? I mean, people are so confused and perplexed by the world in which they live that they fall for certitude.
But the fundamentalists are not uncertain at all. That's the trouble.
No, I say they fall for certitude. And I think that the desperate, despairing people, uncertain people, are very vulnerable to fundamentalism, because fundamentalism promises a certitude which they desperately seek.
That's true, but that means that they make recruits, but it doesn't account for the original core of fanatics.
Well, some fanatics are natural fanatics.
Ah.
Yes.
At the same time, throughout the Western world, that we're seeing, other parts of the world, we're seeing the rise of fundamentalism. We're seeing a tremendous reemergence of urban life, urban culture, people moving back to cities, academic studies and, about cities on the rise. What meaning do you think that this has in terms of greater culture, and how would you contrast that to how would you contrast that to the meaning cities had when they first began to be agencies of culture, of spreading cultural values, which, by the way, you would place when? The beginning of cities as being the important site of cultural movements. And how would you contrast that to the reawakening of the attractiveness of cities today in the Western world?
I'm not sure I fully understand your question. You think of cities as the necessary cradle of culture, and that is true. And you want to contrast that with what?
To contrast it with a reinterest in cities and a reawakening of many Western cities where people are moving back in tremendous numbers, and at the same time there's been a great academic interest in urban history and urbanism.
I see. You infer from this return to the city, which is a source of culture, that we are not losing the spirit of Western culture. It's not in decline, it's not falling away. I don't know. One would have to get some evidence as to the motive for this return to the city. It may be convenience rather than culture. It may be a part of the feeling that we were talking about before, of wanting to huddle with others who are like-minded. I don't know. I'm sorry I can't answer your question.
I'd be interested in Kenneth Jackson's view in this. He's one of the leading historians of the city.
That's right.
Well, I'm encouraged that New York City has become a new, or at least has a new confidence in urban life, and what I hope will happen in the next quarter of a century is that we will rediscover that there are advantages to density and congestion, whereas for so long in America we have been told that the solution to our ills is to escape and all to be on our separate mountaintops. And I hope that we will find that there's some advantage to being around different people and different kinds of ideas.
But now you can have a separate mountaintop where you have, by the new technology, the internet and everything else, you can replicate all the conveniences of the city.
This is not
some of
about
them.
me, so I'll make this my last comment, but you notice that the internet companies are the ones piling up in places like Silicon Valley and Silicon Alley and other places. They are congregating almost more than anyone else at the moment.
As we watch the increasing tribalization around the world and the breakup of nations, at the same time we see intervention by international governments interceding in the misdeeds of these small nation states. Do you see a growing trend toward international government?
No, I don't. The European Union is doing what you described, interfering with the sovereignty of England and France, Italy and Germany, telling them what to do in their judicial system and in their business operations, and that is breaking up the nation, which is defined as a sovereign state. But I don't see any greater cohesion or like-mindedness or smoothness of cooperation. The multiplication of particular incidents of that sort, I mean, of interference with sovereignty, doesn't create anything. It only breaks up so far. And the business world, the globalization that Arthur has referred to, is also a cause of conflict and shifting alliances. None of this is constructive in the sense of building up new units, smoothly governed, policed, and able to maintain peace.
Since your distinguished name heads the list of my advisory board of the Bernard Shaw Society, and since you mentioned Shaw, I would like to ask you, if GBS were alive today, do you think that his optimistic conclusion back to Methuselah when he says, in the year 30,000, we will all have begun to achieve our intellectual competence. It will just be the beginning. And you've expressed some pessimism about where we're going. Do you think if Shaw were alive today, he'd change his mind about the year 30,000 and about our human future?
No, I feel reasonably sure that if Shaw were here and on this platform, he would simply applaud what Arthur and I have been saying. And I'll tell you why. Back to Methuselah is still part of his optimistic phase, as you indicated, but it belongs to the 20s. And he became, as everybody knows, a systematic supporter of the Soviet regime. That was his last sign of optimism, and he was disillusioned. He didn't overtly disavow communism, but his last plays show an almost oriental negativism. He's unhappy about the human race. He has very little hope of its accomplishing anything of the kind that he stood for during his whole life. And he invokes Maya and a kind of Emersonian oversoul as the refuge of the thinking man, of the philosopher. So he would not be sanguine.
In terms of your remarks and perceptions about the decadence of the nation state, how much of a decrement do you see occurring over time from the point of the breaking away of people to smaller and smaller units, of nations coming into smaller and smaller units? Would the United States, for example, go back to individual states becoming countries, to counties becoming nations, to cities becoming entities, and maybe the return of the family unit?
Can you interpret, Ken?
He asked if you see with the breaking up of nations into smaller, smaller segments, possibly even states becoming nations and cities becoming more important entities. And did you connect that with the rise of the family? I'd missed the last comment, but...
Yes, I wondered if that might end up as being the revival of the family unit that everybody talks about.
The family becomes more important as the nations become less important. Do you believe that families are becoming more important, that will become more important as the nation states become smaller and less significant?
But I thought that the family was in a bad way. I don't necessarily believe that it is, but surely whether it is more or less stable than it has been in the last 2 decades, it cannot possibly cope with the problems, obstacles, demands that larger units, nations, continents have coped with in the past. Unless we all scattered in the available deserts, I don't see that the family has much power.
Yes, sir.
You spoke, Professor, about the breakdown of nation states and at the same time the need for smaller communities, for support communities. And then a little bit later, you and Dr. Schlesinger spoke about the creation of the European Union, of Mercosur, of other similar organizations. what do you see as some of the basic characteristics of the international world in the future? Is the United Nations going to succeed? Is the European Union and others such going to take over? What do you see that will lead us from these smaller communities to a more peaceful international organization?
If I understand you right, you imagine that the smaller units can achieve a new form of international relations, and that is very likely. It seems very possible that the region will become a unit, particularly if it is delimited economically. It's already shown signs of developing that way. In France, for example, the government recognizes that there are over and above cities and departments and all the other former divisions, there are regions, and that they must be dealt with differently. And over here, George Kennan, the distinguished diplomat and social thinker, in his last book, says that the United States is not properly governable from Washington. The federal government cannot possibly fit all the necessary demands of this country as a whole, and that there should be 8 regions properly drawn after long study, each of which would be dealt with in a different way with regard to innumerable things that have to be done. In other words, centralization and uniformity are being very severely challenged, and the next unit has not been hit upon or defined or even advocated beyond what I've just said.
We have time for perhaps one more question. Let's go on the far side. Yes, ma'am.
Addressing boredom, how has the advance of technology and the increase of competition, cable, internet, etc., affected the quality of what is seen on the home screen by the public at large?
I can't hear.
Could you repeat that one more time, a little louder?
How has the advance of technology, the increase in competition, namely cable, internet, as well as the broadcast institutions, how has that affected the quality of what is seen on the little box at home?
How has that affected the quality of what we see on our television sets or little boxes at home?
I think everybody can answer that for himself, and I don't mean to dismiss the importance of the question at all. But you see, it implies a kind of standard to compare with. I don't mean a public standard, but one's own. And I don't know what to say about that, especially since I rarely look at television.
I think, if I may add something, that we're very lucky, we're blessed by the fact that television is remains what Newt Minow called in the Kennedy years a vast wasteland. If television were any good, we'd have no time to do anything else except watch it.
On that note, let me just give you 2 quotations about Jacques Barzun's latest book, From Dawn to Decadence. According to American scholar editor Adam Fadiman, Jacques Barzun was born to write this book. It is a masterwork that required a master, a man whose entire life has been spent acquiring the perspective that only wisdom and not mere knowledge can grant. Seconding this praise, Noel Anand says, Jacques Barzun is one of the most cultivated exemplars of Western civilization, and his book contains the experience and the reflection of a lifetime. He tells us not to judge past centuries by our standards, and to recognize that however different, those centuries have made us what we are. On behalf of the New York Historical Society and all the people who were fortunate enough to share in the conversation, we thank Arthur Schlesinger and Jacques Barzun for coming together. Thank you. Drive careful. Well done, Arthur.
Jacques Barzun is the author of 31 previous books, including Darwin, Marx, and Wagner, The House of Intellect, The Energies of Art, and Teacher in America. From Dawn to Decadence is published by Harper Collins. History on Book TV airs twice every week.